and welcome to Roadside, Florida, the program that takes you back in time to those Florida roadside attractions loved by tourists and locals alike. I'm Rene Ramos, director of the Lynn and Louis Wolfson II Florida Moving Image Archives. Once again, my co-pilot is Historian Sylvia Gurinsky. Today, we will be visiting the granddaddy of all roadside attractions, Disney World, with a special focus on the experimental prototype community of tomorrow, better known as Epcot. The amazing Walt Disney had long dreamed of bringing to life his utopian vision of the future. Let's go back to the future and take a look at the not-so-humble beginnings of Epcot.
It was supposed to be the centerpiece of Walt Disney's Florida project, an experimental prototype community of tomorrow, Epcot for short. In his final months, Disney discussed Epcot as a place where people would travel using electric monorails and movers into enclosed, climate-controlled environments. Even after Disney died in late 1966, his brother Roy and other company leaders used Epcot as a basis for the legislation that created the Reedy Creek Improvement District as the governing body for Walt Disney World. But Epcot would have to wait as the Magic Kingdom was completed and opened in 1971. When Disney Imagineers began taking a closer look, the plans would change considerably.
And to tell us more about Epcot, here's Sylvia Gurinsky. Welcome back, Sylvia.
Thanks, Renee. It's good to be back.
So, we have Walt Disney World, and it had been created, and it was just kind of this vision, if you go down Main Street, of traditional America, and it seemed like it just sprang out of a very, very traditional vision of America. But then you have Epcot, which is this vision of the future. Where did that vision come from with Walt Disney?
It came from Walt Disney's frustration with what we always call modern life. Noise, traffic, crowds, too much crowding, too much what he thought of, I guess, as honky-tonk. And it started with his frustrations about what he couldn't do next to Disneyland. We talked about in the Disney World program about the abundance of land that he purchased with the idea of having, as he called it, the blessing of size. And he wanted to experiment with city life, the way, make it cleaner, sustainability, years before it was fashionable.
So we spoke in a previous episode about the Reedy Creek Improvement District,
yes.
And I think you mentioned it. How did that play out with that whole political corporate setup for Epcot?
Walt Disney's effort to get independence and get control over Disney World was primarily because of his original plans for Epcot, to try to create an experimental city community, as he put it, experimental prototype community. And of course that would require some sort of government function in terms of transportation, in terms of utilities, in terms of housing, everything that goes into a city, but in a way that he wanted to control it. And that would change, of course, after his death in 1966, when Epcot, the way he had thought about it, really the clearest vision he had about it was in his last television appearance on his NBC show before his death. And yet, even there, it was very general. It was supposed to be an experimental community. Well, what then? Right.
Well, as we'll see next, Epcot wasn't the first vision of the future to rise out of Florida's swampland and palmetto scrubland. South Florida was home to an even earlier futuristic vision, or perhaps hallucination, that was known as Interama. Let's check it out.
Long before Epcot, there'd always been ideas about experimental concepts and communities in Florida. The best known was Interama. Beginning in the 1920s, civic and elected leaders in the greater Miami area began conceiving of a permanent World's Fair of sorts. It would be a place where countries from across the Americas could meet and experiment with better ways to do things. Serious talk would alternate with fun activities. The name Interama came from the Inter-American concept. Interama had many plans, many leaders, and many United States presidents who thought it was a good idea. Ultimately, what Interama did not have was Walt Disney. Though much was planned, little was created.
Sylvia, what do you think it is about Florida that inspires these utopian, off-the-wall visions of the future?
Hard to say. Maybe the shoreline, the sand, the sea, even the humidity, some would argue at times. But Interama had been bouncing around pretty much since the 1920s in different parts of the greater Miami area. Starting in downtown Miami, there were all sorts of ideas for it, all sorts of plans. Should it be more serious? Should it be more recreational? And it stuck around until the 1970s, and really the last look at it had it more as a serious place.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the prospective location moved north from downtown Miami to the area where FIU's North Campus is today.
So that's what's actually there now.
That's part of it. The Interama building, their planning building, is actually part of today FIU's School of Hospitality Management. It was their library for some time. And the part of the plans, the last plans of Interama included FIU's North Campus and also Oleta River State Park, so some of the natural preservation that took place.
So the Oleta area, there's still kind of a natural component there, but if you look in the area around it, it's quite built up, and it's
it doesn't
bordering
look,
on
there's
the
nothing fantastical about it.
Right.
If you look closely, if you know exactly where to look, there's a street called Interama Drive, if you know where to look for the street signs.
So the one last vestige of the Interama
pretty
project.
much.
So we're taking our first break, but when we come back, we'll travel back in time to the construction and grand opening of the amazing Epcot. Stay tuned. And now, a television commercial blast from the past.
This is Epcot Center. Epcot Center at Walt Disney World in Florida.
Miami-Dade College has career paths in anything you want to be. What's your story? Be global. Be cutting edge. Be inventive. Be investigative. Be a hero. What do you want to be? Be the best. Be you. Be MDC.
Welcome back to the special Epcot edition of Roadside, Florida. Disney was already a well-established player on the family vacation scene, but the experimental prototype Community of Tomorrow, or Epcot, was a plan to tap into optimistic post-war visions of the American future. Remember the Jetsons? They would have felt right at home. Let's watch some archival video of the unveiling of plans for Epcot.
For Walt Disney's dream project, reality played a role. Even with the Reedy Creek Improvement District, Florida's laws made a truly experimental prototype Community of Tomorrow difficult, if not impossible. So Disney Imagineers did the next best thing, a theme park displaying the concept. In 1978, Disney unveiled plans for Epcot Center. Larger than the Magic Kingdom, it was to feature two major parts. Future World would showcase progress being made in communications, energy, motion, land and sea, health and medicine, and even imagination. World Showcase would highlight the landmarks, food, clothing, and especially the people of a number of countries. These would be done through rides, films, and exhibitions.
So Sylvia, it seems like there were some modifications and a step away from the original vision. What do you think Disney himself, the man, would have thought of the shift away from this plan for an actual community where people lived to a theme park?
I think it would have been somewhat of a disappointment for him. As popular as Epcot Center has been, as popular as much as I've liked it, I'm sure, but it was a veer quite away from Walt Disney's original plans, because he was counting on a community, a place where people could actually live and work. And what this turned into was a theme park, granted a theme park that in the early years presented ideas of living, but it was not a place where people per se actually lived.
So we're shifting away from an actual community into something that has kind of its roots into the World's Fairs that had taken place earlier in the century. So if you think about those, what were some of the influences that were lifted off of those old World Fairs and brought into Epcot?
Well, keep in mind that they could take some inspiration for that from the things Walt Disney had done for various World's Fairs, including particularly the 1964 World's Fair. Disney contributed 4 attractions to the World's Fair, the 1964 World's Fair in New York, including It's a Small World. And he had that concept of the world, and the Imagineers, as they're called, pretty much carried that along, and it was carried even further for Epcot than it had been for the Magic Kingdom or Disneyland.
So in a way, it became the ultimate World's Fair.
Pretty much, yes. Especially the highlights of World Showcase showing all sorts of countries.
Well, now we know that when the Disney company gets to work on a project, they go all the way. Construction of Epcot was a monumental task on a scale befitting the futuristic vision and ambitions Walt Disney had for the attraction. Here's some more archival footage showing construction of the experimental prototype Community of Tomorrow, Epcot.
Much in the way the Magic Kingdom had been unveiled a decade before, Epcot Center would be shown through progress in its construction. Spaceship Earth, the centerpiece of Epcot and of Future World, rose gradually through Central Florida's sunrises and sunsets. Spaceship Earth would feature a ride focusing on the history of communication. In World Showcase, the anchor was the colonial architecture of the American experience, which would highlight U.S. history through icons Benjamin Franklin and Mark Twain. As buildings went up in Central Florida, helicopters with Circle Vision 360 cameras went to far-off lands to film the people and places that Epcot guests would soon get to see. Closer to home, designers and painters put distinctive touches on the shows that would entertain, as well as educate.
So Sylvia, we spoke when we discussed Walt Disney World in a previous episode of how secretive the whole construction of the Magic Kingdom had been. Did this continue with Epcot?
Actually, what was unveiled in 1978 is pretty much, with some exceptions, what transpired when Epcot opened in 1982. There was more openness, and that was basically because you already had an audience down the road at the Magic Kingdom. They were very curious about it. So Walt Disney Productions gave all sorts of previews of what was coming up with Epcot.
So I'm going to say that they probably were able to leverage some of the things that they had learned in building the Magic Kingdom into the construction of Epcot. Were there any technical advances or anything?
Yes.
So what kinds of things were brought into play?
Epcot was coinciding with the dawn of the personal computer age. So people were going to get a close look at what was possible. And of course, what was possible in 1982 is now standard and has even gone beyond what was shown in 1982, things such as touch screens, things such as visual communication through telephone, seeing someone halfway around the world and being able to communicate with them. So they really were able to advance beyond what Disney World had had.
And just the sheer magnitude and the size of some of the constructions that they made probably dwarfed some of the things that they had done in Magic Kingdom as well.
Yes, Epcot's a lot larger. It has two separate, Disney World certainly they could take patterns off of Disneyland, of course, although there were some things in the Magic Kingdom, such as Space Mountain, that were added there before they were added in Disneyland. But Epcot was something else entirely. They had not built that anywhere else in the world as yet.
It's time to take another break. But after this short intermission, we'll look at some more construction footage of Epcot, as well as opening day. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Did you enjoy the previous archived television commercial? Well, here's another one.
Step into the future in Epcot Center's newest invention. Step into the future in Horizons. Step into the future today.
Miami-Dade College has career paths in anything you want to be. What's your story? Be global. Be cutting edge. Be inventive. Be investigative. Be a hero. What do you want to be? Be the best. Be you. Be MDC.
Welcome back. We're focusing on Disney's incredible Epcot theme park in this special edition of Roadside, Florida. Let's continue with a look at the ups and downs of the birth of this vision of the future.
There were some delays in the construction of future world pavilions. Horizons and the Living Seas, part of the Epcot Center plans unveiled in 1978, were delayed until later in the 1980s. There were particular struggles with World Showcase. Israel, Spain, and Equatorial Africa were part of the 1978 plans, and Disney Imagineers also thought about adding Scandinavian countries. While Walt Disney always envisioned destinations that were free from cares, the completion of pavilions in World Showcase could not be free from political unrest or sponsorship concerns. Since Epcot's opening, only Norway and Morocco have been added to the original countries in the World Showcase.
So Sylvia, this park, this vision of the future was rising, and it wasn't rising in a vacuum, and there's a whole world surrounding what's happening, and this vision, this kind of utopian vision of the world is surrounded by and maybe influenced by outside events. What were kind of the things happening in the world at the time that had an influence on what ended up being built into Epcot?
Well, particularly those events would influence what was in World Showcase, because there were all sorts of different countries. They had plans for many more countries to be in World Showcase, and of course political events, wars, things like that would prevent some countries from being included. Actually, Epcot had a chance during the Millennium Celebration to live up to that, because they had special exhibits in the year 2000 that were able to highlight actually those countries that they had talked about including at the beginning, besides the countries that are a permanent part of World Showcase. They were able to have exhibits, foods, things like that. And not only were they able to go back to their origins in so doing, but it was also a preview of what was to come with their food festival, their garden festival, the things that people celebrated at Epcot today.
Well, it's interesting to me because we think of the Magic Kingdom as really kind of a purely escapist kind of an exercise. Whereas with Epcot, there's a little bit more of a connection with the real world, albeit an idealized vision of what the world is like. I mean, would you agree with that?
I don't know about the real world, but it certainly historically has been more educational than Walt Disney World. Walt Disney World has its educational attractions, the Hall of Presidents being one example. But Epcot, with some of the things that they had in the early years, were able to provide that instruction about things coming up, horizons. The land had about different ways of growing food. We heard about sustainability at the land, I think, decades before it became a popular catchphrase. There was the pavilion that included the wonders of life. And at the beginning, the world of motion would highlight what was being developed in cars. So it was a chance for people to understand what was going on and what was going to happen.
Well, after years of dreaming, planning, and construction, the big day arrived. The experimental prototype community of tomorrow was now reality, ready to excite young and old alike. Let's jump into our archival time machine and travel back to opening day.
October 1st, 1982 wasn't just the 11th anniversary of the opening of Walt Disney World, it was also opening day for Epcot Center. Visitors marveled at a park twice the size of the Magic Kingdom. They were even more in awe at the attractions. In Future World, they could partake in communications, touchscreen, and robotic technology that's now standard around the world. They could look at the latest advances in growing food, and they could conduct an orchestra, a computer version anyway, by just moving their hands. In World Showcase, guests could take El Rio del Tiempo in Mexico, see China and Canada in Circle Vision 360, and get their Impressions de France in 180, as well as the American experience. Britain, Italy, Germany, and Japan were also highlighted. Of course, that included shopping and food.
So Sylvia, I would say, by all accounts, the construction of Epcot, pretty much following on the heels of Walt Disney World, was a monumental success.
Oh, yeah.
How do you think that influenced the Walt Disney Company's feelings about expanding to other places around the world? Because we know there was a succession of other parks that ended up opening. And how did it influence all of those new parks?
Well, the world, with first Disneyland and then the Magic Kingdom, the world had come to Disneyland and Disney World. This was the start, Epcot was the start of at the time, Walt Disney Productions, later the Walt Disney Company, going out to the world. World Showcase was, of course, a classic example of that, but even in Future World, they were able to have agreements, sponsorship agreements with international companies that opened doors for them to build Euro Disney, to build Tokyo Disneyland, to start having other projects in different countries.
And then, of course, there was also the move into the cruise ship industry.
Yeah, and that too has been very successful. It's kind of an extension of some of the vacations that were developed in the 1940s by airlines, where you could fly on the airlines and come to Miami Beach, stay in a hotel. They'd put you in a hotel and you'd have all your meals and you could go out to the local attractions. It's similar with the cruise ships, because you take a Disney cruise from port, come back, and once you come to a Florida port, you go from there. Where do you go? You go to Disney World and Epcot.
And I would say Epcot's added a few attractions since its opening.
Yeah, it's going into its next. It's had a lot of Disney events, Disney movies that have gone into the most recent generation of Epcot rides and attractions. For purists who like the original educational look, it's not the most popular thing in the world. So there's always that balance that Epcot has to achieve. But then they also have such things as the Food Festival and the Garden Festival, which also attracts a different kind of audience. They try to be quite diverse.
Well, and a continuous evolution That's what Disney is all about.
Very much so.
Well, thanks again, Sylvia.
Thank you.
That's all for this edition of Roadside Florida. Roadside Florida features historical film and videos from the Lynn and Lewis Wolfson II Florida Moving Image Archives. To see more from the Wolfson Archives collection, visit our website at wolfsonarchives.org. You can search the Archives catalog and watch videos online. And be sure to connect to our YouTube channel, where you will find hundreds of carefully curated clips, or link to Wolfson Archives' Facebook page to keep up with our busy calendar of historical happenings. I'm Rene Ramos. Until next time, thank you for watching.